Hi, everyone, and welcome to, I guess this is a bonus episode of Rock Your Shine podcast. As many of you know, um, I wound down this podcast in January of 2024 and did a few episodes of a new podcast called Illumination. But I felt pretty strongly that I wanted to do this particular episode with Rebecca Hewitt. Many of my listeners know Rebecca. I've interviewed her in 2022. I interviewed her in 2023. She was part of my Grief and Loss pilot series. She lost her son, Skyler Hewitt, in February 4th of 2021. And we're doing this episode in honor of her son and also for Fentanyl Awareness Day, which is on the day that this is airing on Tuesday, May 7th. So I want to um, welcome Rebecca back to our show. Thank you for coming on for this, I think, and what I hope will be a very informative podcast on all things fentanyl. We know that it is um, thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are constantly dying from fentanyl overdose. So let's start from the beginning. Oh, I also want to say, for those of you who don't remember, that Rebecca is now a certified grief and loss coach, and we'll have all of her information in the show notes. Rebecca, why don't we start for people who don't know your story? Just can you tell us about Skyler and just sort of like the highlights of his story so that we can begin this important discussion on fentanyl?
Yes, thank you so much for doing this with me. I think it's so important. So Skyler was 25 years old and died from fentanyl poisoning because he didn't choose to take it. He was given pure fentanyl. He was looking for a different drug, but was given something different. And that person is now in prison for, you know, what I think of as murder. He did struggle for 10 years before he died with substance use disorder, and he was in and out of jail and in and out of rehabs and trying so hard to be in recovery. And he was in recovery when he died. He had gone through a whole year of rehab and then was in a sober living facility on that property. And he overdosed one day and from pure fentanyl.
Why don't you go ahead and before we start getting into the weeds around this conversation, can you talk to us? What is fentanyl for those people who may not know?
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. It's used in hospitals and it's synthetic, as in in the hospital, and illegal, made. Fentanyl is synthetic. It's 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. And it's being put into pills and powders and cocaine and heroin and basically anything that
the THC, the pot gummies. That's what I was trying to say. They're lacing everything with fentanyl. And is it because it's a filler? Is that why? Is it cheaper?
No,
What's the reason?
it's added to drugs because of its extreme potency, which makes the drug cheaper. It's more powerful, more addictive, and much more dangerous because it only takes 2 milligrams of fentanyl to be a fatal dose, which is like 2 grains of it. It's being pressed into pills, not equally either. So like, well, I'll get into that later with the test strips and stuff, but yeah, it's cheaper and it's more addictive, and yeah, it's often consumed unknown, like kids
Right.
go to parties. I mean, it's not just someone like my son who did struggle with addiction. It's kids at a party that, and you and I have talked about this, that a kid can go to a party and someone gives them a pill or a hot gummy, and that has happened, and kids are dying from it.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean,
the
because
number one
the
cause of death. It is the number one cause of death in young people ages 18 to 45.
and you know, and I think at this point, probably anyone even listening, they've either read about people dying from it or knows somebody who knows somebody. Um, just
Yep.
myself, I know not several, but a handful of people who have lost somebody they love to a fentanyl overdose. You know, my first encounter with fentanyl was with my mother. Um, you know, in the hospital because they use it as it's the strongest pain medicine, right? I mean, I
Right.
think it's the strongest thing you can possibly use for pain. And
It's mostly
um,
used in late stage cancer for
yeah,
pain relief.
yeah, for pain relief. Yep. Yeah, and my mother, it was, you know, she had had a stroke and she had broken numerous ribs from a fall. And they, you know, and so anyways, that's what I knew about fentanyl before before we got this just explosion of people who were dying from fentanyl, which, and of course, the first time I ever heard about it was heroin overdoses, right? That's, and I think that a lot of people think about heroin, I mean, think about fentanyl and they think about its connection to heroin. But what we're finding is that it's in all of these things, like you said, it's in pills, it's
Yeah.
in pot gummies, it's literally being laced in all of these different things where kids think these drugs are safe,
Yes.
right? You
And
don't think you're going to die
people
from a
are
pot
buying,
gummy.
and people are buying, kids are buying, people are buying pills, fake pills online, and some of them may not be fake, but the majority of them, you have to just assume that they have fentanyl in them, or, you know, if you didn't get a prescription for something that you're taking, then it's like Russian roulette.
It is Russian roulette, absolutely, and kids hear this all the time, and they're at parties, and they're, you know, they get recreational drugs, right, where you think it's not a big deal, and that, you know, and it was funny because I read an article, and it was these 2 young girls, I think they were in high school, may have been college, I don't recall, but each of them took a pot gummy, and each one was rushed to the hospital. One died, the other one didn't, because here's the other thing, that when you're lacing things, you know, you don't know how much, you can't regulate how much is going into these, right, into these different edibles or pills or whatnot. And I think, and that's why
That's
some
the
people are
problem.
dying, right?
Yeah, and that is the problem. There's cross contamination. There's like, you can't tell, like in powder form, it looks just like cocaine.
Exactly. How do
Yeah.
you know? Like, and that's why some people are dying and some people aren't, right? Like you just
And
like
also,
like your son, for
if
example,
someone
you don't
is,
even, huh?
if someone is used to taking opioids, they will have a higher tolerance for one. So if it's a kid at a party and they've never taken anything, they're gonna react differently than someone who has used opioids for a long time. Not saying that, I mean, and also fentanyl in powder form gets into the air and can kill you just from inhaling it in the air. And it has happened. I think I saw a police had pulled this car over and there was fentanyl in the trunk, and some of it was like in the air, and the police officer fell over backwards and they had to
Wow.
Narcan him. He would have died. Like, it's amazing. Even little kids 1 years old are dying from fentanyl because they're
Into
touching
their,
on, or they're inhaling it. Someone in the household, if they're using it, a baby can touch something and put their hands in their mouth, and that is happening.
yeah, I know it is. It's funny that you say that about a baby. I can't remember when it was, but I had read an article. They don't know how the child died from a fentanyl overdose, but they do not know how the child ingested it. And it may have been, and it could have
I'm gonna
been.
come forward and be like, oh yeah, I
Right,
was
exact,
fentanyl in
no, no,
my baby.
exactly.
Oh,
So let's move on. Tell us, like, I know that you are very familiar with the stats, but give listeners an idea. How many people are we talking about that are dying in our country? A year, a day? I don't know what you have for stats, but give us an idea of just how big of a problem this is becoming.
well, it's over 150 people a day are dying from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. And
150 people a day countrywide?
I believe it's the United States.
Yeah.
I think the statistics I have are from that. So in 2011, 2,600 people died from overdose.
Wow.
Then fast forward to 2018, it was over 31,000.
Wow.
Now, 2023, over 112,000
A
people have.
year?
Yes, and 75% is from fentanyl.
Wow.
Like fentanyl laced drugs or fentanyl itself. I know people like can get addicted to fentanyl through their doctors. Like it's different when it comes in a prescription from like a doctor. It will come like in a lollipop or a nasal spray or like a dot on a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was happening, gosh, like back in the early 2000s. I remember watching Intervention, mostly because Skyler was having problems at that time with drugs, and I was at my wit's end, and I wanted to know how to help him, and so I would watch Intervention, which was whatever. But I remember this one girl was addicted to fentanyl lollipops, and it's one of the first times I had ever heard of fentanyl. And
Wow.
she was addicted to these lollipops that had fentanyl in them. And I'm not sure if she was getting, I can't imagine that doctors were giving her those regularly, but yeah, that was kind of the
I don't
first.
understand though. Why was she taking I don't understand what was it
It
pain?
was so long ago, I can't remember if it started out with an accident and she had back pain and or something, she was prescribed it and then started abusing it because it is incredibly addictive. Um, and it was so long ago, I can't really remember. I just remember that it was my first time really hearing about fentanyl.
Wow. So your son, Skyler, died of fentanyl. You don't know how, right? You don't know you don't actually know what he ingested, right? You
I
just
do.
know, oh, what was it?
I do now when I did your podcast the first time, I thought I knew what happened. Because we got fed kind of bits and pieces, and I knew him well enough to know like Xanax was his drug of choice, and I was positive that it was fentanyl, Xanax laced with fentanyl. And also the detective had his phone and I had his other phone, and I read things that he was looking for fentanyl. I mean, not fentanyl. He was looking for Xanax at that time and not having any luck. And then what the detective told me was that he got a hold of some drug dealer and asked for heroin, and the drug dealer said okay and sold him heroin, but it was pure fentanyl, and the medical examiner's report only found fentanyl in his system.
Wow.
So he really didn't have a chance.
He took, this is the first time that I realized that.
It's unfortunately in the beginning, I was just so grief struck, and I wasn't thinking I need the medical examiner's report, or like I was just trying to get through every day.
Right, exactly.
And I
One
was
moment, it's moment to moment. It's
and it was
moment to moment.
a year and a half, and I started having all these questions. And we would call the detective all the time, and he was not getting back to us. Finally, I got through it. I was like, you need to, I was not very nice, let's put it that way. And I also wanted the medical examiner's report, which I had to jump through hoops to get that. And it shocks me that I didn't think or want that way before I got it. But now I know exactly what happened, or, obviously there's still some questions like, why would he do that? He was in recovery.
Right.
He was doing really well. And I still don't know. I'll never know why he decided to do that.
But what's crazy is that what he bought wasn't even laced. It was pure fentanyl. So it was
Which is why
probably,
this guy is in prison and they prosecuted federally.
and they should, and as they should have, because like you said, at that point it is murder. It's not even selling something that you even know is laced. You are selling something that is going to kill the person who is going to be taking it. I'm so
Yeah.
sorry,
And,
Becky.
and thank you.
God,
And
that is just
what's
so,
really sad is that people think, oh, well, he was a junkie. He chose to go get drugs, so it's his fault. Or, I mean, I know people think this. And Skyler was a human being who was super special, super smart, had so much potential, and cared so much about other people. And he wasn't what people think of, oh, a drug addict on the street, they're people. And I just feel like there's just such a
we're not the sum total of the things that we do. People smoke and die of lung cancer. People don't smoke and die of lung cancer. People like it's, this is where I really get on my soapbox around drug addiction because in the work that I do, I deal with people's energy. I do a lot of work with people around um, grief and loss, but also addiction. And with addiction, what this is where I feel so strongly is that we look at addiction as though it is the problem. But for people who have addictive behaviors, I've had addictions in the past,
yeah.
that right, and that it's the solution to whatever the problem is. It might be even though it may be causing us harm, we are all doing the best we can in with where we are in our life, how we've dealt with our traumas, etc., etc. People
It's
who
the
have addiction did not wake up one day and say, I really want to be addicted to a drug. There is nothing more painful. The shame that comes with addiction is profound. And so what happens, it starts with the thought. You want to shut down the thought because the thought creates a feeling. You want to numb that. You are going to go and you're going to do something to numb that.
yeah.
And
And
people who have
it spirals. It's a shame spiral because
it's
I
a
know,
shame spiral. Then you feel shame, and then you start using to quiet those voices, and it goes on and
and
on.
it just gets worse and worse because like with
Right.
Skyler,
It
I
gets,
know he felt guilty for hurting
of
us.
course, all the things.
Yeah, all the things. And there are, and he did do some things, so it is, and I always say, it is a brain disease. And, I feel like I know people are like, when something like this happens, or they know of a young person who, or what, like whatever age, um, has addiction with drugs, they're like, oh, well, God, they must have come from a horrible family and their
Oh,
parents
people
must.
make all sorts of judgments about a whole bunch
Yeah.
of different things, but I want
And
to
I've
say
never been
something.
ashamed of it. I'm like, yep, my son died of a drug overdose. And
There's no shame in it. There's just no
oh,
shame in it. It is tragic on numerous levels, but when you call it a brain disease, I know where you're coming from, but for me, I'm smiling because in the work that I do, when I think of brain disease, it's because we as humans believe our thoughts. And when our believing our thoughts gets us into a whole bunch of different issues, depression, anxiety,
that's exactly what I mean.
addiction, right? It's
Yeah.
we believe what our thoughts are telling us. And and with your son, very early on, he had anxiety issues. I mean, one thing that you told me because I think he was super sensitive, and I know, you're an empath, I'm an empath, and I believe Skyler was also an empath, and that, when we're young, we feel all of the things, and we have absolutely no idea what to do with that deep sensitivity. And so, I guarantee if we got a bunch of empaths in the room, we all had our coping mechanisms of what we did as little kids because we did not know what to do with the barrage of emotion. I was a worrywart. I worried about everything. I worried about things that most kids my age didn't worry about, like, are the aliens going to come and are they going to I worried about
Me
literally
too.
everything. I was like a worry wart. And so my mother wouldn't let me look at the news because I would take things and I would worry. And so with Skylar, I mean, I think that one of our earlier interviews, something that you said that has always struck me and stuck with me is when he would chew holes through his little sleeves. And that is the extreme anxiety for a little kid. And
Yeah.
so, and he was also,
And
I
I
don't
think
know.
he did feel things super deeply, and he took things extremely personally. He always his
Mhm.
whole life, very defensive because he took things so personally.
And it's
Um,
very challenging in this world to be an empath, but then for a guy to be an empath, it's even more challenging because culturally, our little boys are taught to be strong and they're not supposed to cry and they're not supposed to feel things. So I think it's even that much more confusing for empathic guys
he did,
because, huh?
he did cry. The
Yeah,
last time I saw him, that's all he did was cry all day, actually.
yeah.
His girlfriend and him and his girlfriend had broken up, and it was Christmas Day, and he cried all day long.
Yeah.
Like, uh, and he was 25 years old.
Yep, exactly, and we're told, our little boys grow up that, they're not supposed to cry and they're not. I always feel for our grown men because I'm like, it must be we think it's so challenging as women of all of the things that we grow up, that we've had to grow up with in our culture, all these things that we're supposed to be. But our men also deal with the same, it looks different, but the same kind of pressures of who they're supposed to be and how they're supposed to show up in the world.
Right.
Um, I think it's amazing that we all don't overdose on something because it can be so challenging and so painful in this, in our experiences. And so when I think about your son, who knows why he did? Maybe he had a really rough night. Maybe he was celebrating his sobriety, and I know that that sounds ridiculous, but I think about people who lose weight and they celebrate with giving themselves a treat. You'll never know, and it doesn't even matter, right? Because the end result is the end result. And I feel like I have such a deep respect for you, of taking this tragedy that has happened in your life. You're raising awareness around fentanyl. You've become a grief and loss coach. And so I want to ask you, what is happening? What are the resources out there? How are kids being educated? What is going on to help educate our young people around the catastrophic consequences of buying drugs off the street?
Honestly, not enough, in my opinion. I honestly I don't really know that. I don't know if it's even really allowed to be talked about in school. Um, I'm not really sure. I know I feel like every teacher should be mandated to take a class on fentanyl, like,
Mm-hmm.
so that they can have discussions, and definitely parents of even young kids need to start having those conversations. Not just one big lecture, but short little conversations, um, about safety, about what this drug is and can do, um, and in digestible pieces rather than, because I think a lot of people will be like, oh, here, have a seat, and we're going to talk about this, and they lecture their kid for 2 hours, um, when it should be talked about pretty regularly, even if it's for a couple minutes.
Mm. What's
Um,
out there right now? You talked about a couple of things before we started
yeah,
recording in terms of what happens if somebody, we've heard of Narcan, right? I mean, we can talk about, or I have, I don't know if everybody has, but what happens if somebody is actively witnessing somebody overdosing? What can we do?
well, you can get it's naloxone. The brand name is Narcan. You can get it at the pharmacy over the counter,
You can
and
just have it, like you can have it
have
on
it.
hand.
And
What is it? What is Narcan? What do you do with it?
it reverses an overdose in minutes.
But
Um,
what did they, how do
it,
you, is
you
it,
it's like a nose inhaler. So you squirt it up the person's nose and it will reverse it in minutes. And it's
interesting.
available over the counter. And I mean, anybody who has a loved one or that, has substance use disorder, or even, God, nowadays, if Skyler now was a teenager and was, if it was different and I know what I know now and Skyler's a teenager, I would always have Narcan on me, always. But I
Would
mean,
it
even,
have, do you think it would have saved him with the amount that he ingested that night? Do you know? I
well,
guess it doesn't matter, but
you know, before he went into recovery, which he was there for a year and a half. So, before that, right before he went, he overdosed 3 times on drugs laced with fentanyl. And the first time he died, they brought him back with Narcan. Like 3 times they had to Narcan him.
wow.
The people he was found in the first time he was found in a bar bathroom unconscious,
Hmm.
and he could have died. And one of the times that week he was with his dad and was like losing consciousness in the truck, and we called the ambulance. And but and what and I mean, I can give the signs of an overdose.
Yeah, give us the signs of an overdose. I think that that's a great segue.
Yeah, so pinpoint pupils, and I've seen it, unfortunately, and their pupils will just become tiny
Tiny,
little
tiny. Yeah.
dots. So that's a big one if you see that on somebody. Falling asleep or loss of consciousness, slow or weak breathing or not breathing, um, choking, gurgling sounds, limp body, cold, clammy skin, and discoloration, especially the lips and the fingernails.
Hmm.
So those are signs of overdose, I think, with not just fentanyl, but
In
heroin.
general, and yeah.
Yeah. So and I'm just gonna say, like, if somebody is overdosing in front of you, the things that you should do is call 911, obviously, and administer Narcan if it is available. Try to keep the person awake and breathing, and lay the person on their side so they don't choke. Stay with the person until emergency assistance arrives.
I think it's so, and again, this is, I'm hoping that parents are listening to this and are able to talk to their young, their teenagers or just to get the message out there. But for any young people listening, and you are actively using, or you have friends that are actively using, um, just the idea that you can have Narcan available, God forbid that you need it. I am certainly not sitting here trying to encourage drug use, obviously, but I do.
You want to be able to save a life.
Yes, you can save a life. And knowing that you can just get that at your local drugstore feels like a
Have it
no-brainer to
on-
me.
Right. I mean, even if you don't know anybody, you might be in a place where you could
You're
save.
right. That's another really good point. You could just be at a
Also,
bar, right? You could be at a restaurant. You could be anywhere.
right. And for those who are using, you can buy test strips that will test for fentanyl. It's not foolproof. They are very
Talk
inexpensive.
to me about these test strips. What do you, they can test the drug that they want to use?
Yeah, it will test for fentanyl, but with a lot of these fake pills and things that have fentanyl in them, half the pill could have fentanyl and the other half could be fine. So if they test it,
Oh,
it's hard to, it's not like it's distributed perfectly through anything. It's pressed it into pills but it's definitely better. Like, don't test just a little piece of what you have, because the other part of what you have, whether it's powder or whatever, it should be tested. But it also, and like I said, it's inexpensive. I think you can get it at the pharmacy. I'm not really sure about that. But I'm pretty sure you can get test strips anywhere. Also, it doesn't, like, there's a strong, like, it won't detect strong, it may not detect stronger drugs like carafentanil, which is
mm-hmm,
stronger than fentanyl. It's like used, I think it's tranquilizer for animals like an elephant, it's
mm-hmm.
terrible. And that is becoming a thing as well.
Wow.
So yeah, that's, what you can do, and you can find information online, but I also wanted to talk about where parents can go
Yeah.
um to get information, and how to talk to your kids, and the right and wrong ways to do that. And so you can go to the newdrugtalk.org. It provides education, free tools, expert advice, and helps your family connect and stay safe. So that's a really good resource.
That's great. We'll have that in the show notes and the link to
Yeah.
that.
And, fentanyl has changed the way this world is looking at drugs now. I mean, never has, I mean, we're talking more deaths than suicide, car accidents, like you name it. It's the leading, um,
Wow.
yeah, and so the way we talk about it has to be different than how we used to talk about drugs. Like when I was a teenager, you know, it, it, it was just a totally different time. And now, I mean, before my son died, he lost like 4 or 5 friends to fentanyl before he died of it. I
Wow.
mean, and I have known people since he's died that have died of fentanyl. I mean, it's just it's mind-boggling. And it's kids, and then their
God,
families
it is just,
and
it's so tragic.
it's so
It's
much
just so
grief.
tragic.
Like, it's more than the deaths of COVID. And the problem is that, you know, overdoses rose during COVID because of isolation, and, there wasn't as much access to help during that time, or
Right,
mental
exactly.
health.
Right, exactly. And also, I mean, let's face it, drugs and alcohol skyrocketed during that time anyway. I mean, it was very, talk about self-medicating. It was an extraordinarily stressful time for everybody. And on
Yeah,
top of that, people who were using it just increased, right? We weren't working, we weren't going to school, like all of these things. It was and then some people went the opposite direction and gave up everything. So COVID certainly did for those that were heavy into their abuse, it exacerbated for a lot of people, and we saw an increase there as well. So, Becky, I mean, as we're winding this interview down, is there anything else you want to say about this topic that we've not talked about?
I mean, I want people to, get educated on this, even if it's not touching your life right now.
Yeah,
Um, Most likely it will, if it
yeah,
hasn't already.
right.
And teachers, I mean, like, I don't know what they're doing in schools right now, but this should be they should be having someone talking at school about it. Teachers should be able to talk to the kids about it, ask open-ended questions. Like,
Yeah,
I guess I want anyone listening to this to just educate yourself,
yeah.
y- you know,
And
hopefully.
your kid,
And,
because
yeah, well,
that's what I feel like.
so you can
Kids,
educate other people.
yeah,
Yeah.
because
And
kids,
your children, of course, yes.
I don't think I still think that there is this notion that if you're not doing heroin, you are not at risk. I can't prove that. I haven't read about it. It's just an intuitive feeling that when I think about fentanyl, I do think that people equate that to heroin.
Right.
And
I think you're right, but it's because they're not actively probably educating themselves on it. And I wouldn't have either if it hadn't directly affected my life.
right, right.
Um, I don't know, because I don't know how you can live in this world right now and not know of the crisis, the opioid crisis and fentanyl crisis. Um, because it's everywhere. And I don't even really
Everywhere.
watch the news much because,
Right, right.
but
Not good
it's
for the mental
everywhere.
health.
It's everywhere. And I find it hard to find someone who isn't affected by
Right.
either fentanyl or drugs in general.
I
Like,
know. Same.
yeah.
So
So
we're going to have resources in the show notes. We'll also have all of Becky's information. And I highly recommend, if any of you are out there grieving, especially grieving parents, to give Becky a call. She is accepting clients right now. Um, so I want to thank you, Becky, for being on today's podcast and sharing your story so generously. You always have done that. And now having this really important conversation about fentanyl and trying to increase people's understanding and their awareness. And I just want to thank you for that.
thank you so much. This is so important to me.
I know. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you it's hard to say enjoyed this episode, but I hope you got something from it. And I wish you all well. Bye for now.